Hello, my name is Dr. Adam Dixon. I am an associate professor in globalization and development at Maastricht University. I'm also the principal investigator of a soon-to-be-finished European Research Council project on sovereign wealth funds. In February, I'll be the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, if you'd like to look me up then. I'm going to give you just a very quick overview on sovereign wealth funds. To underwrite, if you like, our discussion that we will have in person very shortly. So I've been researching sovereign funds for about 15 years. I've written numerous articles, book chapters, several books, as well as a more recently published book by the publisher Agenda entitled Sovereign Wealth Funds. And what I want to do now is just talk to you a bit about what sovereign funds are and what they're not. Now, why sovereign funds are interesting is that they really expanded significantly in number in the last 2 decades. Now, we've had sovereign funds in existence since the 1950s with the Kuwait Investment Board, which was founded in 1953 in London, actually. And over the years, we've had more and more sovereign funds created, namely in natural resource rich or natural resource exporting economies, particularly in the Middle East, but also funds that have been started through the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves, such as Singapore. Now, in the last 2 decades, though, and even in the last decade, we've seen a significant proliferation in the number of sovereign wealth funds. Most of these are small, and not all of them are based on, let's say, having a significant surplus capital or surplus savings available to a government. Many of these are smaller development funds as I'll discuss, which are often initially capitalized by either a privatization of some sort or a direct contribution from the government budget. Now, the first thing to say about sovereign wealth funds is that, in principle, they are financial institutions. By that, they are financial institutions that exist to invest in some kind of financial security, bonds, equities, or infrastructure projects. They have an investment function. And we can actually say, when we look at sovereign funds, that they have an investment function, but they also have a policy function. And understanding the policy function is important for dictating what the investment function is. But the important point is that they are, in any case, financial institutions that are invested in whether global financial markets or domestic capital markets. And when I say capital markets, not necessarily stocks and bonds, but developed in where capital is allocated in a particular economy. That can be invested in private equity, it can be invested in infrastructure projects. But in principle, they operate like you would think a financial institution or an institutional investor in the private sector would. If an organization or, let's say, a government entity is not doing that investment function, then they shouldn't be called, let's say, a sovereign wealth fund, right? So we should separate out what we think of as sovereign wealth funds, as in wealth of a state or a government or of a people, from sovereign wealth funds, whereas the former is quite abstract from those that are a distinct financial institution that operates in domestic or global capital markets. Now, as I mentioned, the financial or the policy function can vary from fund to fund. And here I'm going to share my screen, or I am sharing my screen. I'm going to share it so you can see my screen here. And I'm just going to show you this one slide. And in this slide, what I've done is, and this is functions that aren't just that are pretty common in the literature. We understand what sovereign funds are, and the primary types of sovereign funds that we see are, and this is why I have on the left here, function, savings funds, precautionary savings funds, a buffer fund, and development strategic funds. And I'll go through one by one each of these and describe a bit about what they are and give some examples. So An important type of sovereign wealth funds, ones that I think grasp the most attention in the market. That's why I put examples here of the Norway Government Pension Fund or the Australia Future Fund or various funds in the Middle East. So Qatar Investment Authority or Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Kuwait, or these are the types of funds that often you read about in the media when we think about sovereign wealth funds. And these are very large, primarily based on an export or natural resource exporting economies, again, Norway, Middle Eastern countries. And the investment objective of these funds is to be long-term savings vehicles that save current resource revenues for future generations. And the way they go about it in terms of strategic asset allocation is typically in some form of a globally diversified portfolio, but again, with a long-term investment horizon. And each fund is different, right? So Norway, for example, is not very much invested at all in private equity, or it's slowly getting into kind of private markets, but for the most part, it's invested in public markets, whereas the likes of Abu Dhabi are invested quite diversified into private equity, public markets, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Now, the second type of fund are what you could call a precautionary fund. And here I have two examples from the Latin American case, in particular Chile. And as we have, this particular meeting is with colleagues from Chile. There's plenty of knowledge, I would assume, in the room to understand what the Chile does with its copper revenues, but it's a very interesting and very, so far, effective way of managing the volatility of natural resources in the case of Chile in terms of copper revenues. And these precautionary funds are primarily what we would refer to as a stabilization fund. And the primary aim is to ensure stability for the government's spending of those natural resources over time, knowing that natural resource revenues are volatile. And how you do that in the case of Chile, the policy, just briefly, is based on a 10-year projection of copper prices, and the investment of the fund is in relatively liquid assets, such that they can be easily accessed in the short to medium term if copper prices collapse or if there's an economic shock. The purpose of these types of stabilization funds isn't per se to save for decades on out. It's really to save within a shorter time periods following the natural resource revenue cycle, with, again, the purpose of creating stability for the budget. And I think this is something that we should talk about in our meeting in terms of assuming this financial function. It's about providing that stability for the budget, that can then do other forms of public sector spending and investment, right? So whereas the precautionary sovereign wealth fund, stabilization fund, is a financial institution investing in capital markets, the purpose is not to the purpose is to provide that stability to public spending, which is in many cases quite dependent on natural resource revenues. Now, another type of fund is the buffer. And again, what's also important is that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, these particular categories, right? So in the case of Norway and some of these savings fund, there is an element of stabilizing natural resource revenues for these funds, but it's also about addressing absorptive capacity constraints with the influx of income from natural resources. And but we can look at a buffer fund as a type of fund that the investment objective is to manage the absorptive capacity from large foreign exchange inflows. And the point of the strategic allocation of these funds is capital preservation, liquidity with short to medium term investment horizons, right? So in the case of China, for example, this is, I mentioned the example here of SAFE, but there's also the Chinese Investment Corporation, is that China has so much foreign exchange reserves accumulated that they're actually losing if they keep those in foreign exchange. So they try to go out and gain a higher return on these investments. But in principle, it's about managing the foreign exchange reserves such that you can prevent issues with absorptive capacity or manage absorptive capacity of large foreign exchange flows, which for natural resource exporting countries is an issue. Now, the final category, and this is where we see many new funds emerging, are what we'd call a sovereign development fund or strategic investment fund. And these are the investment function of these funds, again, as financial institution, is to contribute to development and modernization of the economy in sectors deemed strategic to long-term economic interests of the country. So these are like but different than national development banks in that these are primarily focused on equity investment or investing in a manner that the National Development Bank doesn't do or might not do very well in some instances. But if you like, many of these funds exist to act as it's like a state-owned private equity fund. And the way they do that is through long-term investments in local assets and investment projects, infrastructure projects. But many of these funds are also the owners or the holding company of state-owned enterprises. And so these funds will exercise their ownership rights to influence management of these invested firms to make them more competitive. So examples are the Rwanda Agasira Development Fund. In Senegal, you have the Fonds Stratégique d'Investissement du Sénégal, which is their strategic fund, Ireland's Strategic Investment Fund. So these are not either exclusive to developing countries. So Ireland's Strategic Investment Fund is very active. And there are examples elsewhere, such as Morocco. And so these funds, again, are focused on the domestic market, but they're also focused on catalyzing more foreign investment often, right? Or creating a platform to get foreign investment into the country, acting as a catalyzer, as a platform, or as a co-investor to attract foreign capital. So these funds typically are of interest to countries that are looking for different ways beyond or complementary or in addition to other forms of public investment through the budget. So these are the four types of let's say, sovereign funds that exist in the world. But I think what's really important for our discussion when we think about investing in biodiversity or whatnot is that a sovereign wealth fund is a financial institution. And it could, if you like, be utilized to manage biodiversity investment schemes, right? So in the case of Gabon, their sovereign fund has recently gone out and is looking to find investors in, if you like, credits to protect their rainforest, and utilizing then that capital to go and invest in different parts of the economy or to generate a return for the government. Now, the point, though, is that in any case, these types of investments, they're financial investments. This is about capitalization. And what is important, though, is that sovereign wealth funds aren't a development panacea, and they should be seen simply as one tool among many. And in all cases, for sovereign funds to be successful, the governance of these funds has to be very strong. There has to be alignment with the policy, and there has to be commitment on the side of the government or the state, as well as public buy-in as to the general mission of these particular funds. So that's what I'd just like to share with you in preparation for our discussion. We can discuss more details about thinking about sovereign funds and biodiversity protection. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon.